I woke up to the sound of something unfamiliar, a deep rumbling that didn't belong on my land at this hour. For years, my mornings had been the same, waking up to the soft rustle of the wind through the fields, the gentle low of my cattle, and the distant hum of nature greeting the day. But today the peace was gone. The air smelled wrong, thick with something mechanical, something foreign. My chest tightened as I swung my legs over the side of the bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes while the sound grew louder. By the time I pulled on my boots and stepped outside, the early morning sunlight glared against the metal frames of bulldozers tearing through my south pasture. For a moment my heart stopped. The land my grandfather had broken with his bare hands, the fields my family had cultivated for generations, was being torn apart as if it were nothing but an inconvenience in someone else's path. The tire tracks were already cutting deep into the soft earth, the once green grass now nothing but shredded clumps of soil and destruction. I felt a heat rise up my spine, the kind that had nothing to do with the sun. My fists clenched at my sides as I stormed forward, boots sinking into the ground with each step. My voice came out sharp, cutting through the morning air like a blade. The nearest worker, a man with a hard hat and a clipboard, barely looked up as he gestured for the bulldozer to keep going. My stomach churned, a slow, seething fury building as I moved toward the man in the orange vest who seemed to be in charge. He turned just as I reached him, adjusting his helmet like he was expecting me. Before I could speak, his mouth opened and the words that came out made my blood run cold. Just following orders, new road going in, HOA approved. HOA. The word slammed into me like a brick to the gut. The homeowners association from that new development just beyond my property line, the one that had been breathing down my neck for months, trying to strong-arm me into letting them carve a shortcut through my land. I had told them no. I had told them no in every way a man could, legally and personally. No deals, no easements, no right to take what didn't belong to them. And yet here they were, their machines roaring through my land as if my words had meant nothing. As if I had meant nothing. Before I could get another word out, a sleek black SUV pulled up, rolling over the dirt with the kind of arrogance only money could buy. The door swung open and out stepped the man who had been a thorn in my side since the day those fancy houses started popping up. Tom Wilson, your president and self-proclaimed king of all things entitled. He was dressed like he had somewhere important to be, his suit crisp and spotless, a smugness to his face that made my teeth grind together. He took his time walking up to me, looking over the damage his people were doing like he was admiring a piece of artwork. "Morning, neighbor," he said, flashing a politician's smile, all teeth and no sincerity. "Just a little road work, nothing to get worked up about." I stepped forward, barely keeping my voice steady. "You're trespassing," I said, my words slow and deliberate, as if saying them any faster might set off the fire burning in my chest. "This is my land." Tom shrugged, glancing at the destruction his crew had already caused. "It's progress," he said smoothly, as if that one word justified everything. "Your land's in the way of progress. We need this road. You're being unreasonable." My jaw clenched so hard it ached. I had dealt with men like Tom before, men who thought power and connections could bulldoze anything in their way, including people like me. My land wasn't just dirt and grass. It was my family's history, my blood, my legacy. And these people, with their polished shoes and empty smiles, thought they could pave over it like it was nothing more than an obstacle. I pointed at the mess around us, at the deep scars their machines had already carved into my property. "You think I'm just going to let this happen?" Tom's expression didn't change, that smug little smile still tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's already happening," he said. There was the arrogance, the entitlement, the belief that I was nothing more than a footnote in his grand plan. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms. My granddad used to say there were two kinds of men in this world, those who built and those who took. Tom Wilson was a taker, and he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He had underestimated me. I took a slow breath, forcing down the white-hot anger boiling under my skin. My wife Betty always said that anger was like fire. You could either forge steel with it or burn everything to the ground. Right now I needed to be steel. I met Tom's gaze, my voice low and steady. "You're going to regret this." Tom chuckled, shaking his head like I was some old fool who didn't know when he was beaten. "We'll see about that," he said before turning on his heel and walking back to his SUV. The tires spun against the dirt as he sped away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my land, the sound of bulldozers roaring in my ears. They thought they had won. They thought I would roll over and accept it. They didn't know me. They didn't know what I was capable of. By the time I reached my porch, my hands had stopped shaking. Betty met me at the door, her eyes filled with worry. "I called the lawyer," she said softly. "Good," I replied. "But I'm not waiting around for the courts to fix this." Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't argue. She knew me too well. I wasn't the kind of man to sit back and let others decide my fate. Tom Wilson had declared war on me and my land. And if he thought I was going to back down, he was dead wrong. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen over my land, I was already at work. My hands were calloused from years of farming, but today they clenched with a different kind of determination. The road those arrogant bastards had started carving through my land was still fresh, the deep tire tracks of their machines cutting scars through soil that had known nothing but crops and cattle for generations. The air smelled of torn earth and diesel, a bitter mix that made my stomach churn with rage. They thought they could take what was mine, roll over me like I was nothing, but they had underestimated the man standing in front of them. I climbed onto my old Caterpillar backhoe, a machine that had served me well over the years. I had used it to dig irrigation ditches, clear stubborn land, and even pull an old tractor out of the mud when my neighbor got stuck last spring. But today it had a new purpose. My fingers tightened on the controls, and as I pushed forward, the mechanical arm extended, sinking into the newly laid dirt like a predator sinking its claws into prey. With a groan of metal and force, I ripped into their precious road, dragging trenches deep enough to make it utterly useless. The morning air filled with the sound of breaking ground, of defiance given form. I worked methodically, destroying every inch of their so-called progress, burying their arrogance beneath layers of ruined soil. By the time the first car rolled up, I had already turned their shortcut into a useless, impassable mess. I shut off the backhoe and climbed down just as the SUV screeched to a stop. The door flew open and there he was, Tom Wilson, Nature King himself. His suit was as perfect as ever, but his face was a shade of purple that almost made me laugh. His mouth worked, trying to form words, but all that came out at first was a strangled, sputtering noise. "What the hell did you do?" he finally managed, his voice shaking with fury. I wiped the sweat from my brow and looked him square in the eye, my heart steady. "Fix your mistake," I said, my voice calm but firm. "This is my land, Tom, and I told you, you weren't building a damn road through it." Tom took a step forward, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the disturbed soil. "You son of a..." He cut himself off, inhaling sharply as he pointed a shaking finger at the torn-up road. "Do you have any idea how much this is going to cost? How many permits we had to pull? How many hours of work you just erased?" I let out a slow breath, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in my chest. "Not my problem," I said simply. "You didn't have permission. You thought you could take what wasn't yours. Now you're seeing what happens when you mess with the wrong man." Tom's hands clenched into fists, and for a second I thought he might actually take a swing at me. Instead, he let out a sharp breath and pulled out his phone, jabbing at the screen with stiff fingers. "You're going to regret this," he muttered, stepping back toward his car. "I'll see you in court, old man. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I folded my arms across my chest, watching as he climbed back into his SUV, tires spitting gravel as he sped away. My pulse was steady, my resolve unshaken. Let him sue me. Let him try. This wasn't just about a road. It was about standing my ground, about protecting what generations of my family had bled and toiled for. No slick-talking HOA president was going to take that away from me. But I should have known. Tom Wilson wasn't the kind of man to fight fair. The lawsuit arrived faster than I expected, a thick stack of legal papers shoved into my hands by a process server who barely met my eye before scurrying back to his car. I stood on my porch, thumbing through the pages, my jaw tightening as I read through the ridiculous claims. Obstruction of public development. Destruction of essential infrastructure. Even a section about me inciting hostility toward the HOA. It was absurd. The arrogance, the sheer audacity almost made me laugh. But Betty didn't laugh. She sat at the kitchen table that night, her fingers gripping her teacup tightly, worry etched into the lines of her face. "This could get ugly," she said quietly. "Lawyers, court fees, all of it. They have money, they have connections." I reached across the table and took her hand in mine. "I don't care what they have," I said. "What they don't have is a right to my land. And I'll be damned if I let them win." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, paperwork, and intense conversations with my attorney. Tom Wilson, true to his nature, had pulled every string he could, calling in favors from city officials, pressuring local politicians to take his side. The HOA had painted me as some backward old farmer standing in the way of progress, spinning the story to make themselves look like the victims. But what they didn't count on was the truth. They didn't count on the fact that I had my own evidence, my own history with this land. And most importantly, they didn't count on how much I was willing to fight. The day before the first court hearing, I stood at the edge of my property, looking at the ruin they had left behind. The land still bore the scars of their intrusion, but I wasn't beaten. Not yet. Tom Wilson thought he could bury me in legal fees, grind me down until I had no choice but to give in. But he didn't understand men like me. He didn't understand what it meant to stand your ground, to fight for something bigger than yourself. As I looked out over my land, I felt the same fire in my chest that my great-grandfather must have felt when he first broke this soil. The same unyielding strength that had been passed down through the generations. They thought they could take what was mine. They thought they could break me. They were wrong. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with people eager to watch the battle unfold. Some were from the new development, the same people who had waved at me from their manicured lawns when they first moved in, now whispering among themselves, convinced that the HOA was fighting for their best interests. Others were farmers like me, men and women who had spent their whole lives tending to land, their weathered faces set in grim determination. And then there was Tom Wilson, sitting at the plaintiff's table with his overpriced lawyer, the kind of man who made a living twisting words until they no longer resembled the truth. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his smug confidence barely contained as he sat with his arms folded, watching me like he had already won. He truly believed that money and influence would tip the scales in his favor, that I was just some stubborn old man fighting a battle I couldn't win. But he didn't understand that I had come prepared, not just with my lawyer but with the truth, with documents proving that my land was mine alone, with records that detailed every underhanded move the HOA had made, and most importantly with the unshakable resolve that had been passed down through my family for generations. When the judge entered and the case was called, my lawyer stood, his voice steady as he laid out our defense. The HOA had trespassed onto my land without permission. They had destroyed my pasture, had illegally begun construction, and then had the audacity to sue me when I put a stop to it. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes that missed nothing, listened intently, her face unreadable as she flipped through the documents we had submitted. Then it was their turn. Tom's lawyer, a slick-looking man with a voice like silk, stood and began spinning his story. According to them, I had been unreasonable from the start, had refused to negotiate, had willfully damaged an essential infrastructure project that would benefit the community. He painted me as the villain, a bitter old man clinging to the past, unwilling to compromise for the good of others. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms, but I didn't let the anger show. I had to be patient. I had to wait. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. My lawyer stood and called our first witness, an engineer who had worked on the road project. I watched as Tom's smug expression wavered ever so slightly. The engineer, a man in his 30s with nervous hands, hesitated before speaking. He had been subpoenaed, forced to testify under oath, and as the questions came, his reluctance became evident. And then the truth slipped out. The HOA had started construction without the proper permits. They had cut corners, used loopholes, and ignored the necessary legal processes because they thought no one would stop them. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Tom's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The engineer tried to backtrack to soften the blow, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she asked for clarification. And when the engineer confirmed, albeit reluctantly, that the HOA had acted illegally, I saw the first real flicker of doubt cross Tom Wilson's face. But we weren't done. My lawyer called another witness, a city official who, after some careful prodding, admitted that the HOA had been pressuring the city to approve permits retroactively, trying to cover their tracks after the fact. More murmurs. The judge's frown deepened. And then came the final blow. Documents. My lawyer laid them out carefully, showing clear evidence that the HOA had willfully trespassed, had ignored cease and desist letters, had even attempted to manipulate local officials to push their project through. Every piece of evidence was like another nail in their coffin. And as the judge reviewed them, I saw the shift in the room. The audience, once filled with quiet speculation, was now buzzing with realization. The HOA wasn't the victim here. They were the aggressors. Tom Wilson's face had gone from smug to pale. His lawyer, once smooth and confident, was now stumbling over his words, trying desperately to salvage what was quickly slipping away. But the judge had heard enough. She set down the papers and looked directly at Tom. Her voice was calm, but the weight of her words was crushing. The HOA had acted unlawfully. They had no right to build on my land. Their lawsuit was not only dismissed, but they were now facing counterclaims. Damages for the destruction of my pasture, trespassing charges, and legal fees that would cost them more than they had ever anticipated. It was over. Tom shot up from his seat, his face red with rage. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking. "This man is standing in the way of progress. This is his fault. The judge silenced him with a single look, her patience clearly exhausted. "Sit down, Mr. Wilson," she said coolly. "You are lucky I am not holding you in contempt." He sank back into his chair, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. But deep inside I felt the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing justice had been served. As we walked out of the courthouse, Betty squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with relief. The weight that had been pressing down on us for weeks had finally lifted. But as we stepped outside, I saw Tom standing near his SUV, his face twisted with fury. He locked eyes with me, and for a moment I saw something dark there, something unsettled. He wasn't done. Not yet. Some men, when they lose, accept it with dignity. Tom Wilson wasn't one of those men. And as I watched him clench his jaw, as I saw the barely contained rage simmering beneath the surface, I knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. 3 nights after my courtroom victory, I woke up to the smell of smoke. At first, my half-asleep mind struggled to process it, thinking maybe Betty had left something on the stove. But then the acrid scent thickened, burned my nostrils, and before I could even sit up, my gut twisted with a feeling I couldn't ignore. Something was wrong. I shot out of bed, barely registering Betty stirring beside me as I yanked on my boots. The moment I threw open the window, my breath caught in my throat. The night sky was ablaze with an eerie orange glow, flickering and angry. My south pasture was on fire. Flames licked up into the darkness, devouring dry grass, smoke billowing thick and fast. I could hear the frantic cries of my cattle, the crackling of burning land, the distant shouts of my neighbors. My land. My home. Burning. I didn't think. I ran. The screen door banged behind me as I tore across the yard, my heart hammering like a war drum. The closer I got, the more the heat clawed at my skin, the fire roaring like a living beast as it swallowed everything in its path. I grabbed a shovel from the barn, swinging it wildly at the creeping edges of the blaze, but it was useless. The fire had spread too fast. Too deliberate. I barely noticed the sirens until the fire trucks pulled up, red lights flashing against the smoky darkness. Firefighters stormed out, shouting orders, dragging hoses, dousing the flames with everything they had. Someone grabbed my arm, Daniel, my closest neighbor, his face streaked with soot. "It's too late," he yelled over the roar. "Let them handle it." But how could I just stand there and watch? It felt like an eternity before the fire was finally under control. The sun had just begun creeping over the horizon when the last embers were extinguished, leaving behind a charred, smoldering wasteland where my pasture had once thrived. I stood in the middle of it, boots sinking into the scorched earth, the scent of ash clinging to my skin. The fire chief approached, his expression grim. "No doubt about it," he said, voice rough. This was arson. The word settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, but I didn't need him to say it. I already knew. There was only one man who had the motive, the arrogance, and the hatred to do something like this. Tom Wilson. The sheriff arrived an hour later, asking questions, taking statements, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. He knew as well as I did. Men like Tom didn't leave evidence behind. No cameras had caught him, no witnesses had seen him. He was careful. He had covered his tracks. Betty stood beside me, silent, her hands gripping the edge of her shawl like she was holding herself together by sheer will. When the sheriff finally sighed and said, "We'll look into it," I knew that meant nothing. Tom would get away with it. But if he thought this was the end, he had underestimated me one final time. Tom Wilson had played his last card, and he had played it poorly. He had shown the entire town exactly what kind of man he was. The HOA was already reeling from the lawsuit, struggling to justify their actions to the community. Now they had a leader who was suspected of burning a man's land to the ground. The board members, once blindly loyal to Tom, started jumping ship. Some resigned outright, not wanting to be caught in the fallout. Others stayed just long enough to hold an emergency vote. Less than a week after the fire, Tom Wilson was removed as HOA president. But that wasn't enough for me. With my lawyer's help, I filed a civil lawsuit against Tom personally, not just for the road but for harassment, for damages, for emotional distress. The evidence from the original case was enough to make the lawsuit stick. And even though the arson couldn't be pinned on him directly, the stain of suspicion followed him everywhere. His name became poison in the community. Without the power of the HOA behind him, he was nothing. By the time the lawsuit was settled, Tom had lost more than just his position. He had lost his reputation, his standing, and a good chunk of his money. Months later, I stood at the edge of the south pasture, the land still scarred but slowly healing. New grass had started to push through the blackened soil, stubborn and unyielding just like me. Betty stood beside me, slipping her hand into mine, her fingers warm despite the cool autumn air. "You did it," she murmured. "You fought back." I exhaled, watching the wind dance across the fields. "I did what I had to," I said. "Just like my father did. Just like his father before him." I turned to look at her, a small smile playing at the corner of my lips. "They thought they could take what was ours." I squeezed her hand. "They were wrong.